Hey guys, Henning and Morten from FlippedNormals here, and in today's video we are doing a free introduction to Marvelous Designer. So a lot of people are wanting to get into Marvelous, and searching around you might find that there's not a lot of free content available to get you into this, and sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating just shelling out a bunch of money for training for software you might not know if you like. So hopefully this introduction is gonna get all those doubts away, because this is an awesome piece of software for making fabrics. But before we get into that, we are just going to shill our own products. That's contradictory, maybe. If you do like this series and afterwards you feel like you want to get into more advanced topics of creating fabrics, we have two products especially. The first one here is our Concepting with Marvelous Designer and ZBrush series, where we do a full piece of garment in Marvelous and take it into ZBrush. This gives you a lot of good knowledge of how to work with Marvelous and ZBrush in a pipeline. So this one covers a lot of fundamentals. It's also very basic in the beginning. So even if there are things you might have forgotten from the free introduction, this is going to definitely you're going to get caught up with this here as well. Then we also have our newly released streetwear outfit in Marvelous Designer, where it's more focused on purely Marvelous. We don't really do any pipeline stuff. So we make this outfit from start to finish. One of the, highlighted pieces from this garment is the tied sweater around her waist, which is kind of tricky to do. Also more in a stylized fashion, but still being, on the realistic side. So if you do want to pick these products up, make sure to head over to the FlippedNormals marketplace after you've watched this video.
Link in the description.
Yes. So let's get started with the introduction here. So just to start off with, basic Marvelous, you have a basic avatar, and these Marvelous ships with a few avatars. You have kids, women, and men. And if you want to check any of these out, you can always go and say open avatar, and you can load in a new avatar. When you do that, you're presented with this menu where I would highly recommend to say automatically add arrangement points. That just gives you arrangement points that's easy for you to then affix fabrics to. But we'll look into that in a little bit, if that's a little bit confusing. So for this purpose, one thing I feel like a lot of series might not cover is how to work with your own models. Oftentimes you'll be showing stuff on the basic Marvelous avatars, but they're not always, they're fine, but they're not like super nice. Oftentimes you have your own base mesh and you want to get it in, and the workflow between Marvelous and other 3D softwares can be a little bit confusing just because of the scale. So to start with, we'll import a quick base mesh that I made just before this. So we'll go to File, Import, OBJ. And then I have this mesh here called Mesh. Open that, and then we have the Import OBJ menu. So there's a bunch of options here. What you can do, like we're making a new scene, so in the import option, we're just gonna say open. If you say add, it's just gonna add a secondary avatar, and then it's gonna be confusing once you start simming. So we're just gonna open it, load it as an avatar. You can load it as a garment if you want to sim it as well, which is interesting actually. And then again, automatically add arrangement points. This is a new feature in Marvelous 8 where it'll add arrangement points for you to position your fabrics if your mesh is like kind of in a A pose or a T pose. So it's not going to work with all meshes, just because it does like some, probably a machine learning thing under the hood. It's so popular these days. So automatically add arrangement points and then set it to auto scale. It can be tempting to tick this off and then try to say, no, okay, I've imported, and just set it to auto scale, and that's going to work with whatever you exported it out as. Import, and here we have our beautiful, beautiful avatar. So just as a quick note, so you don't have to skip until the end to figure this out, if you wanted to export this specific avatar again, so it works in the 3D software you exported from, just go to File, Export, OBJ selected, because we only selected the mesh. Give it a name, like Mesh 2. And then here, the most important thing to consider for exporting is the scale. Just set it to centimeter or Dash Studio. I find this works with Maya and most other 3D software. You can go in and then mess with the scale afterwards if it doesn't, but centimeters should work most of the time. So with that in place, the first thing I always do when I open Marvelous, if it's a fresh installation or whatever it is, I change the way everything works in here, like navigation and display, because it's not really, like, at least for me, it's a little confusing. So first go to settings, and then you go to user settings. We're going to change the navigation in here. Under view controls, change it from, I think it's set to regular mouse in the beginning. Me coming from Maya, I'll just set it to Maya. You can do 3D Studio Max as well if you want. You can also make your own, but for me, Maya works the best. So the way the navigation works with the Maya is just regular Maya navigation. Hold down Alt, and then you do everything with the mouse buttons for that. So Alt left mouse button is to rotate, and Alt right mouse button is to, Alt middle mouse button is the pan, and Alt right mouse button is the zoom in and out. But again, if you have other preferences, feel free to just tweak those settings. The next one is going to be the gizmo, which I changed from, like, if you look at this, if you click on your avatar, you can see the gizmo is sort of locked to the screen, which can be kind of confusing once you start putting your fabrics in place and you want to move them around. So just go to preferences, gizmo, and change this to, I usually keep it to local, because then it's local to whatever you click. So that's just, now we have an actual 3D gizmo to move around. Okay, the next thing is usually I just change the color a little bit on the avatar. Pretty simple, you just select them and then go to material and select the color. This is just to differentiate it from the default fabrics, which are going to be white. And the navigation works the same in the 2D view over here, which is you zoom in and out with Alt and right mouse button, and you pan with the Alt and middle mouse button. Obviously you can't rotate because it's a 2D view. So that leads me into, I mean, it should be pretty self-explanatory, but this is the view where you preview all your 3D and you simulate it. And this is the view where you actually draw your patterns. So there is a feature where you can draw in the 3D view as well for more complex shapes. We're not really going to be covering that, but it is possible. But I tend to never really work with it because most of the time I have pattern reference. So that makes it a little easier to figure out, less guesswork. So to start with, we are going to be importing our reference plane. And we're not going to be covering like every single menu item to start with and then start to work. The way we've structured this tutorial is we'll sort of like introduce it to you as we go along, because then you can see specific use cases for the tools or how you use them. I think that's a little easier to wrap your head around instead of getting presented with like 40 different tools and then try to remember which one does what.
Yeah, it gets very intense right away and your brain is going to be overloaded.
So just to load up our reference, I make a plane, just the rectangle tool here. You can press the S key as a hotkey to activate the tool, and then you just drag it out. Nothing fancy. So as far as I know, there's still no good way to import references in Marvelous. This is the best we got. So we technically create a piece of fabric and put a texture on top of it so we can have our references here. Then with the A key or this edit or transform pattern tool, we can then select it and then just move it around. Where it occupies the space here in the 2D viewport is not really important. You can see it's not linked to the 3D viewport once it's created. But in the 3D viewport, we just want to get it out of the way. And we want to keep this area fairly clean because this is going to be our reference for creating our patterns. There we go. So again, with the A key, this is how you manipulate a lot of things in the 2D viewport. So we can select our fabric and then we want to assign a special fabric just to this reference plane so that it doesn't interfere with our other fabrics. So to do that, we just select the plane and hit assign. That's going to create a new fabric and assign it to the mesh. If you wanted to reassign the first fabric, for example, you could select this fabric and then just say under fabrics, change it to fabric 1. You can see now it's highlighted in yellow there. This little tick mark means that every time we create a pattern now, by default, it's going to get that pattern out there. So we can change that by doing this. So again, we'll just change this back to fabric 2. Cool. Now, to apply the texture, we actually go into the fabric, not we go into the material for the fabric and not the actual fabric itself. And then here we'll have basic texture settings. You can load a normal map to do, game-like seams in the viewport. You can change the reflection, how rough it is. This can be good for previews inside of Marvelous, just to differentiate your fabrics a little bit. So click this little button, and then by default you'll be taken to this, for some reason, random folder where Marvelous stores a lot of its stuff. So we'll just head to our intro here and just load up this reference. There we go. So this reference here is based on what I made for this tutorial. We cheated a little bit and prepped beforehand. It's always better that way to not like make it up on the spot. So this is the t-shirt we'll be creating here. And right now it's kind of hard to see what's going on. So the first tool we'll be using over here is going to be our edit pattern tool. So if you hit the T key, it's going to be this tool, edit pattern or edit texture. And then we can simply just click on it. That activates our gizmo. And you can see this is our pivot point. So we can move this around just by holding on it. We can rotate it just by clicking this. And then we can scale it up as well. So we'll just scale this up to maximize space a little bit. There we go. Now, what could be helpful is if we just take this, hit the A key, and then move it over top of our little avatar, because that way we can sort of roughly guess the size of this, just so it's not completely off, even though it's not transparent. So A key again to move it up. So with the legs there, that's going to be about right. If you hit the T key, it actually becomes transparent, so we can see it a little better. Maybe scale it down a little more. There we go. Oh. There we go. So now we have the rough size that we want for this. So if we move this over again, then we can start tracing the pattern. And this is pretty simple. This is like the backbone of how to use Marvelous. So let's just check here. Okay. The first tool that we'll be using for creating patterns is going to be the Polygon Tool, which you find here. So before we just used the rectangle one where we just drag out a rectangle. So the Polygon Tool allows us to be a little more freehand. We can click. It's kind of like the marquee, not the marquee tool, the Polygon selection tool in Photoshop, where you just select off stuff. So you can just click around. If you hold it down while you drag, it creates a curve automatically. So I tend to not really use predefined curves in my fabric like this. I tend to create them manually after I make the fabric. It just makes the creation process a little bit easier. See, it was still set to fabric 2, so we'll just set it back to fabric 1 here. So, Polygon tool in hand, and then we'll just start tracing around. So we'll just be creating one side of this just to speed up the process, because that means that we can sew with symmetry. So it's kind of like if you're sculpting with symmetry in ZBrush, you only have to do one side and then you just mirror it over. So I just simply tap on these points where I want them. So for these, you can see there's a little bit of a curve going in. I'm just going to keep it straight for now. It just makes it easier in the beginning. So you can keep it straight with either, you see this, it turns pink when I get down. This is a smart guide that's automatically activated in Marvelous. You can also hold down Shift to snap it to angles if you want. So we'll just have it there, and there, and there. Now that's our first piece of fabric. So you take that and put it over here. So to start with, you can see, because it's linked to the 2D position, this is where it gets created in the 3D view to start with. So then we just move this over, and then you can use the F key to zoom in on your fabrics as well. Now we're going to have a little bit of an issue with these two fabrics here. If you hit the space key, that's how you simulate things in Marvelous. So if we just hit space now, it's going to fall down because there's nothing to hold it up. And you can see it's quite slow at simulating right now. That's because this reference plane, like I mentioned, is not just a reference plane. This is an actual piece of fabric. So if we go and look at our wireframe, you can see this is pretty dense. So let's just hit Control Z to undo that. So the first thing we want to do after we've created our fabrics is make sure that this doesn't impact anything. So by selecting this in here, it's the same hotkey. Like if you press the A key in the 2D viewport, you can press the A key out here. Select your fabric. And then we want to increase our particle distance to the max, which I think is 500. So now you can see we have like, I don't know, 30 faces. It's going to be a lot quicker to sim, because no matter what this is going to be simming, we can hold it in place so it doesn't move anywhere, but it's still going to be, you know, taking up CPU power whenever we sim it. So just right click on your fabric and say freeze. And then even in the 3D viewport, you can go in and then you can like hide your fabric. So if you just say hide 3D pattern, now it's not going to be distracting in the 3D viewport at all. So back to the regular mesh view, and then we sort of like position this. So obviously it doesn't look like a t-shirt right now because it's a little off. I'll just center this. So the first thing we want to do when we start modifying this, or at least this is how I work, is I first block it out, very basic. Then with the C key or the curve tool, you can then just go in and then you can start adding curves. So if you just press C and then you just drag on any line here, it creates a curve, which is a pretty handy tool. And then afterwards, if you want to tweak this, you can see you can change how this sort of like Bezier thing works with the curve. But if you want it to have a little more control, you can hit the Z key or the C key after you've hit the C key. And that gives you these handles where you can more precisely modify the curve. So again, the regular C key, C for curve to move it around, and then Z for, I don't know, not curve, to just like really nail it down. So that's usually how I work with it. I try to keep the curves fairly simple. A good rule of thumb, so like press the C key and then the Z key, is I try to keep this like perpendicular to this previous line, if that makes any sense. If it goes in like this, that just means that the angle is going to be nicer. It's hard to explain, but I feel like if you look at it, it makes sense. If you go too extreme here, like if you do this, like these tend to not really work that well. So I try to stick to some more, say, let's call them conservative curves. That just makes the fabrics look a lot better, I think. So let's just tweak this a little bit. You can pull it up. So like I never really want to go below perpendicular to the previous line, but you can definitely go up like this to make the curve a little more subtle. So that's going to be our front. Obviously we're missing half. Super easy here. In your 2D viewport, just hit A, select the fabric, right click, and then a bunch of options. But the one we're going to be concerned with is symmetric pattern with sewing. So hit that, and then we get a second piece of fabric. So this piece of fabric is just a duplicate, which is then mirrored over, and then we can just position it anywhere. Now, when it's symmetric with sewing, that just means that, first of all, it's flipped and it's linked, so it's instant. So whatever you do to one, it's going to be reflected on the other. It doesn't matter which side you do it on. And if you do any kind of sewing, let's say I was sewing on a sleeve here, if I had another sleeve, that would automatically be sewn onto this part. So that just, again, speeds up our workflow. So usually with the smart snapping on, I like it just pull in the center. And then to just give a little bit of spacing, again with the A tool, the transform tool, I just select my fabrics, and then with the arrow keys you can just move it out a little bit just to give yourself a little bit of spacing. There we go. Now it just looks nice and clean. So obviously, again, if we were to sim this right now, this is just going to fall straight down, so we don't want that. So there are a few different things you can do in order to preserve your fabrics where they are. One thing I like to use is tacking, where if you hold down the W key and you click on a piece of fabric, you make these orange tacks. I don't know if there's a name for them. They're hard to find in the documentation. I just call them like quick tacks. So if we sim now, again, hit the space key, these are being held in place. You can clear these if you press Control and W. Now they're just going to fall down. So that's one way to tack something in place while you sim it. This is a fairly common technique, especially when you're doing fabrics in real life. Obviously in real life, you can't tack something in mid-air. So another popular way to do it in real life is tacking onto the avatar itself with this one, tacked avatar. So you just click your fabric and click on the avatar where you want it to be tacked. And we can do that for the other one as well. There we go. Hit space, and then it automatically gets tacked onto the avatar. So this is a pretty cool feature. What we're gonna do now is we'll just sew these together, and then we'll do a backside of these afterwards. So the first thing we want to do when we sew is make sure that, you know, everything works the way it's intended. And like a good rule of thumb is that you want all your lengths to be pretty much the same. You can have a little bit of variation in the lengths just to give a more realistic feel, because oftentimes, at least that's my philosophy, is when you make any fabrics, they're never going to be like, let's say this was 500 millimeters long. This is never going to be exactly 500 as well. There's like a little bit of difference, but you can't do like, if you want something to fit nice, you can't do 500 and like 550. Maybe you do this one is 500, this one is 502 or something like that. You can always vary it. It's best to keep it pretty close in the beginning and then change it up towards the end. So press the Shift and the Z key, you get your lengths up. Oh, that was pretty close. 532 millimeters. So you can see these two are both 532, so they're going to be sewing onto each other perfectly. Obviously, if we had like the outside here, which is 364 to the inside, this would crinkle up. This is a common trick if you want to create like this pinching or pleating effect that you offer, like on pleated skirts, for example, you would do that. So to sew these on, there's two kinds of like methods or tools you can use. And the first one is going to be just the segment sewing. This is the fastest and easiest sewing tool to use. You just click it, it's the N key, and you can see there's this line here. That just means that you can have two sewing lines with the segment tool on itself. That probably doesn't make any sense. It just means you can sew multiple fabrics onto this line. So if we were to sew these two together, you can sew this one to this one, you can see now they're sort of like, it's previewing where it would be sewn. If we change this and sew it to the bottom, now we're going to be sewing the bottom to the front. So let me just show you what happens. I'll just go back here to the 3D view. You can hit A or you can hit Q to go out of whatever tool you were using when you're in the 3D viewport. Hold down W to just quickly tack these on. And now let's watch a black hole form. So, I mean, you can kind of guess what's going to happen here. Press space to sim it, and that's just a mess, you know? So this is a very, very common issue. So to fix it, if you have this edit sewing line tool, press B for that. If you select your tool here, and you can right click, and then you can reverse your sewing. So if you did mess up a sewing line like this, very, very easy to correct, or just Control B is the hotkey. And now you can see in our viewport, this looks a lot better already. So again, just hit space, and now that gets sewn on there.
I know it didn't break physics.
Except that we still had the sewing lines or the tacking on there. So let's just remove that. So edit tack is this tool. You can just select the permanent tacks, remove those, and then hit space again. There you go. So now that sits on well, it doesn't sit on the body, but these two are now sewn. So later we're going to be removing this line here in the middle. But again, this is just for ease of use right now. So the easiest way I find to do this, like if we're making the back, is like not tracing this again, but actually just duplicating this. So let's hit space to go out of sim mode, Control W to clear the quick tacks. And then we just select these two, just like any other normal selection. You select it with the A tool, hold down Shift, and then you can select multiple fabrics. Control C, Control V to paste it over. Hold down Shift for a specific angle. There you go. Now we've got a second piece of fabric. So in the viewport here as well, you don't have to do this. You can also just a marquee selection with the A tool enabled. And then we just move this to the back, press F to frame it. Now you can either rotate this around, or you can right click it and you say flip horizontally. Does the same thing, it's just a little faster, especially with the hotkey Control-G. There we go. So now we have 2 pieces of fabric, and we just want to sew these together. Now what I showed you before was the segment sewing tool. We just sew 2 equal parts together. You can use the segment sewing tool for parts that aren't the same length as well. Like I could sew this to that, but again, you know, that would look weird. You also have the free sewing tool. The free sewing tool is a more specialized tool where you want to control, let's say, I only want a sewing distance that's that long, for example, and then I want to sew that onto that part there. So that's what the free sewing tool does, just to quickly show you, but we're not really going to be using that a lot. So the next step is we're just going to sew these together. And sometimes it can be hard to wrap your head around how do things translate from the 2D view into the 3D view. So if you just simply click on your mesh, you can see, okay, that's that part on the front. So remember what we did before with press N for segment sewing. You know, we have these 2 different sewing lines, and we want to make sure we sew the correct part on each other so it doesn't like create that black hole. So by selecting this in the 3D viewport like that, we can see, okay, we would start from the right hand side, and we need to sew it onto this side here, which is that side. That just makes it a little easier to find out, especially with more complex fabrics.
Yeah, so for this specific case, you know, you could probably visualize that. But if you have something which is not just a simple t-shirt, this would be really practical. Yeah,
we're going to see that when we do the sleeve. That's a little more complicated. But the cool thing is in Marvelous 7, I think they introduced, or maybe it was 8, they introduced this free sewing and segment sewing in the 3D viewport. So, you know, that makes it a lot easier to visualize, but it's just so you had the option. So again, press the N key for segment sewing and then sew those 2 parts together. Now with magic of symmetry, you can see this has already been sewn or already like created the sewing line here because it's symmetrical with sewing. So hit space to sim it, and there we go. Oh, he's got this.
Nice poncho.
Nice poncho. So for t-shirts, now this is not going to be so much about specific fabrics or like how patterns are made, but we still want to make this, you know, fairly close to how it is in real life. So this back part here, you can see there's quite a big drop here. Usually there's more, well, all the time on people, there's more volume here than there is here, and we want this slight slant down. So if you hit the Z key, where you can then edit your pattern. Remember we did this before, where we hit the C key for curve, then we hit the Z key so we could edit the individual curves. If you just hit the Z key, you can select individual vertices or points, which you can then move around. And then just move it like you would normally. Hold down Shift for snapping. And then we can go into the curve tool and maybe edit that curve a little bit. See, it looks a little weird. Hit the Z key, and then we can just tweak this curve to be a little more natural. For some reason, you can also use the V key for this. So V or Z, whatever you want to do. Sim again. Now this is a fairly standard t-shirt or vest shirt pattern for front and back. Cool. Now, next up, let's just sew these parts together. So again, N for segment sewing. Like the faster you get familiar with the hotkeys, the better off you're going to be in Marvelous, because it's so much better to work with hotkeys in here. Just because now there's a lot of tools, but most of the tools that you'll be using are fairly simple, and it's always the same tools over and over again. So I would highly recommend that you familiarize yourself with the hotkeys.
Yeah, we're also listing all the hotkeys in the description as well.
Yeah. Now, if you, because we had a pattern reference here, right, to start off with, so we could see how many points we needed to add. You can see we added this point, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points here. If you only added 5, and you made your pattern and you realize, oh shoot, I didn't have another point in there, so I can't make the sleeve, you can always go in with the edit or add point tool, which is the X key. Just select the point somewhere on the mesh, and now you had another piece of or another point in there. So that was a quick tip for that. Another thing we're just going to be doing is to better visualize what this looks like out of Marvelous once we, like, say we get it into ZBrush or Maya where we add thickness, is you can add the rendering of the fabric to thickness. So then we get it double-sided as well. And then we have a little bit of thickness to it. Just makes the previewing a little more realistic, if you will. There we go. Okay, next up, we are going to be handling a sleeve. So sleeves are annoying, but if you have reference for sleeves, they're a lot less annoying. So that was why, it's primarily the reason why I made this beforehand and wanted to provide this as a reference, because sleeves are a pain in the butt. It's such an unintuitive shape, you know? It's like how are you ever going to be able to visualize this if you've never made a sleeve before?
So if people want to find their own reference for something like this, how would they go about that?
You just Google anything pattern, like hood pattern or t-shirt pattern, dress shirt pattern, dress pattern in Google. And because Marvelous is being used so much now and Clo3D is being used so much now, it's really easy to find pattern references. Sweater pattern, anything pattern, that'll typically work. I don't really have any websites anymore that I go to. I usually just use Google. They have most of what I need. So to do this, again, we'll do the same basic blocking technique where we don't use any curves or anything to start with. So when I make something like this from scratch, let's do that actually. You can see it's actually doesn't have like a center point here for symmetry, but that's usually how I would do it. So let's do that just to illustrate how this would be done. So I'll create a point here, one there, one straight down to there, and then we'll skip this little curve in there, like this. Okay, with the C key for curve, we can sort of match this. So I'm gonna keep this Z key. I'm gonna keep it in this view right now, just so I can match this, because sleeves are the bane of our existence when we make this. So again, for this stuff here, you can see now I'm going above perpendicular. That's gonna not flow as nicely into the other part. So you wanna try, especially when you have connecting parts like this, you really wanna try and keep it pretty close to perpendicular, and then like have this nice shape that flows into the other one. Something like that. Cool. Now we can select that with our transform tool, press A, and we'll just move it over here. Find the 3D view. Oh, something I actually haven't covered. Like if you click on your object and it doesn't, like the gizmo doesn't show up, it's a little bit temperamental. Just keep clicking it. Like you see it disappeared there, just click it somewhere else and the gizmo will eventually show up. This is something that, I don't know, I've been using Marvelous for the past 5 years and I still don't know how to fix that, but I just keep clicking it. So keep that there. So in order to get the other side now, it's super handy in Marvelous. Just go to your 2D view, hit the Z key, and then you can manipulate these lines. Right click this line, and then you say unfold. There you go. So now you have the other side as well. Like this is assuming it was perfect from the beginning and nothing's gonna change. We can always go in and change this curve or change the sizing of this if we need it to be different.
That unfold feature is awesome.
Yeah, it really saves a lot of time. You can do that. You could do that with shirts as well. So it's pretty cool. All right, and then we'll just roughly position this. And this is where, hit F to zoom in. This is where arrangement points come in real handy. Until they added it, where they had the automatic arrangement points, the way I would do it, like right now, if I were to sew this part to this part, it wouldn't really wrap around the arm. So usually how I would do it is I would just sim it like this, and then it roughly, gets that shape there. But with arrangement points, you can actually just turn them on here. You can actually just select your fabric and select the arrangement point you want it to wrap to. Boom, and then
that's awesome.
Really quick stuff. So again, this is an auto-generated arrangement pattern because this pose was close enough to whatever algorithm figures it out. If you have a more extreme pose, this is not going to work. It's not going to generate this for you. So we'll just turn this off again, and then we can move this into place. So sewing on patterns are just sleeves are just always annoying. Making them are annoying, the shape of them are annoying, and sewing them on is annoying. So I'll show you why. So now you're gonna this is where, like, I don't know, spatial mind, you have to train it a little bit to figure out, okay, how does it actually work? Where do I start the sewing, and what is it going to look like? So it's not too hard to figure out that this part obviously goes up there, but then you kind of have to, in your mind, like, see, okay, so this part, like, we track it around here, goes down there, and then eventually this point here is going to be sewn onto that point right there. And if you keep an eye on the 2D view while I do this, you can sort of track that line and see where, okay, that would go there to there to there. So that's a way to visualize it, again, with clicking on it in the 3D viewport. So this is where the free sewing actually comes in really handy, but not just the regular free sewing. This is where the M&N free sewing tool comes in handy. So M&N, I don't know what it stands for, but what the tool does is that if you have a surface, so quick math, this is around 500 milliliters in length, millimeters, not milliliters. So if we click on this point here, right, we can see that it's 503. And like, if I wanted to sew this onto another point, let's say this one, which is 236. Let's do that. The M&N free sewing tool automatically figures out the spacing here and takes the 500 millimeters and squeezes them into 236. So if I sew this on now, just to illustrate this, it doesn't look very nice, but trust me, it saves a lot of pain. That's the terrible example. Anyway, just trust me on this one. It actually sews it on, so this part here is like nicely fitted, and you can use this for, like, if you have that, I don't know, I'm not good with history and numbers, like knights and like the big, like Victorian dresses that have those like big pouches on the shoulders, that kind of fabric, where you get a lot of puffiness. You know, that's how you would do that. So isn't this something a bit more extreme than a t-shirt thing? Yeah, exactly. Something which doesn't flow nicely into each other, I guess. Yeah. So for this, again, the easiest way to do this is if you have a clear anchor point. So a clear anchor point is something like this. We can see the two surfaces meet, and we know that this part here, we're going to have two surfaces meet each other also in this part. So that's where we're going to start our sewing from. So if you just make sure to hit the M&N free sewing tool, you see in the 3D viewport, we can actually trace this around. But I find that it doesn't always work that well when you go all the way around the surface. That can be a little confusing. So if we look at the entire 2D view now, we can just see, okay, if we track up there, that's going to be that part. So we'll start by doing that. So we'll click there, then we'll hit enter, and then we'll see, okay, so where do we go next? Well, okay, then we go there, so we could start from there and then go over to the other side. And then we would go all the way around. So we kind of have to do that in one action. The way it works is that you mark a whole piece, hit enter, and then you mark the other second piece. So sometimes this tool can be a little confusing to use, but bear with me. So let's see. We'll select that part from the sleeve, go all the way over, hit enter. So because we started here, we know that we want to start there. And then we want to finish over there. So we start there, go top to bottom like that. And now you can see it gives us a little warning saying that, oh, you're about 29 millimeters off. This is exactly what I told you not to do in the beginning, but for a sleeve sometimes this can work out. So just hit space, hit enter, then hit space. There we go. So now it's been sewn on, and then all we need to do is just sew these two pieces together, hit the N for segment sewing, and then we can do that directly in the viewport. Sew it again. And now this t-shirt piece has been sewn on. And to quickly get your sleeve onto the other side, so you don't have to do the work twice, you just right click on the pattern, symmetric pattern with sewing, and you can see we get some sewing lines here. So then we just move it into place real quick, like that, because now it's already been flipped to the right side. Just be mindful of trying to get it to not intersect too much. It makes it a lot easier for us. Then you just hit spacebar to sew it together, or to sim it. Okay, so now we have the basic t-shirt here. So what we can do now is just tweak it a little bit. So if you remember from our reference, you can see we had like some curves that go in a little bit on the sleeves as well. So we'll just do that by hitting the Z key, selecting a piece of it, and like just with the arrow key, like moving it in. That just tightens the sleeve a little bit.
This is a really nice way to technique to use, just to refine the design, because sometimes you're not going to get it perfect the first time.
No. And another thing to keep in mind is for like t-shirts and dress shirts is like the back side here. Oftentimes you will actually have you'll find that it's bigger on the back, maybe like this. So we can move it down. So just selecting these parts identical. So, see, this is still 364, but the pattern one for the sleeve is going to be a little bit bigger. So we can go in with the C key, just make this a little deeper here as well, just so it matches a little bit better. Then we can resim it. And then that means that the t-shirt is now going to have a drop here at the back a little bit. Then we can again with the Z key, or the Z key, it's confusing with C and Z. Select these points and form fit it just a tiny bit. We'll do that on the front and on the back as well. So that just pulls it in, makes a little bit of a V shape as well. Usually for like male t-shirts, well, not all the time. Some male t-shirts they will have this. And for if it's a female kind of shirt, what you might want to do is go in with a curve tool and form fit it even more to like accentuate the silhouette. But usually for men, you don't do that.
It is crazy how different the design is just based on some simple points.
Yeah, it's just a tiny bit. Sometimes it's just 5 millimeters, and it makes a big difference.
Changes it from like very, very regular t-shirt to like more heroic to more feminine right away.
Yeah. So now we can get started with some of the detail work. This is really, this is the basics. This is most of what you need to know, but we can just take it a little step further. So with the Z key, we want to make a collar. So usually the way you would make a collar in real life is you would just make like a straight bar, like this, and then you would just sew it on. I find that in Marvelous, most of the time, that gives me a result where the collar sort of pops out too much. So what I found is if you hit the Z key, select the line here, don't worry about the second line because it's symmetric, so it's already selected. Select this one, hold shift and select, so you add it to the selection. Then what you can do is just right click on any line there and say offset as a pattern outline. Now you can see that's going to be creating an actual outline of the pattern. So we'll do, 15, 18, let's do 18 millimeters. So it's going to create this part. Then an important thing is you want to turn on create internal lines. I'll show you why. It doesn't make sense to just explain it. So hit OK. And now we have this part. So if we sim this again, we now have a collar. But it's a little hard to distinguish it. That's why we made the internal line. So the internal line is purely a guide for us to cut this piece off, because right now these are actually one merged piece. So hit the Z key again, select that line, shift select that line, right click and say cut and sew. So this is a really easy way to create additional pieces of fabric to give your clothing more detail. So just sim that, like that. And then we can do what we did before for the sleeve, where we just select this part, right click and say merge. Don't worry about the angle, doesn't matter here. And we'll do the same thing here, just say merge. There you go. You can always go in and you can adjust this so it looks a little more perfect. And then in the 3D view, hit the N key, and then we just need to sew these parts together. So we're speeding up a little bit more now because we're just going over the same kind of tools that we've been using since the beginning. Hit space to sim it, and now we actually have a collar, with a little bit of detail work here. So another way to add detail work is to utilize the internal lines. So the internal lines can be used for more than just cutting things off. So one way I like to detail things is by adding internal lines and then varying the pressure around them. So a good example of that, let's do a sleeve, for example.
So what is an internal line?
So an internal line is just, it's a line that's internal. It's like a
sewn line into the fabric.
Yeah, basically. But you can use it for a lot of things. Like you can sew other pieces of fabric onto an internal line. You can use internal lines to create more detail by like embedding it. But it kind of works like a sewing line.
But so it's not a visual thing, it actually changes
the fabric. It's not just a preview thing. So if we, with the Z key, we can just select this part, and this part is automatically going to get selected as well. And then we'll do Shift Select on the back as well. And now these are selected. So right click. So instead of saying offset as pattern outline, we're going to offset as internal line. So we can see this actually offsets it internally. What we can do is you can say reverse direction and offset it externally. It doesn't make sense for this shirt here, but I'll show you in a second where we can use that. So let's do 8 millimeters, 7. Hit OK. And now we've added 7 millimeters around there. Okay. So we select these internal lines now. Now you actually do have to select them. There we go. You're going to have this property editor over here where you have fold strength and fold angle. So that just, with that selected, you can select your internal line. And so 180 is 180 degrees, which means it does nothing. Like right now, it just lies on the surface. But if you change this to something like 200, 270, sim again, you can see that we actually start to cut into the fabric a little more. To make this a little more extreme, we can add that to the tops of the sleeves as well. So we're going to right click. So with the Z key, select the curves, right click and say offset as internal line, 7 millimeters is what we had before. Now they're already selected. Set them to 200 and then sim again. And now we get, it's kind of like, okay, we've added a little bit of sewing detail in there. So that's a good way to sort of cheat it in Marvelous Designer.
It just makes it look more realistic. It just adds more details instead of having to sculpt this in later on.
Yeah. So like we did with, collar, we'll do the offset as pattern outline for the sleeves and the bottom of the shirt as well. So, add it to your selection with Shift, right click, offset as pattern outline. We'll stick to the 18 millimeters. Remember to create it as an internal line because we'll use that internal line as a guide to cut it off. That's been created. So just select these, select that, right click on there, say cut and sew. That cuts it off and it sews it on, sim it again, and now we've added more detail. The annoying thing about this is you do have to go in and manually sew these together. So with the segment sewing tool, I just sew this part to this part. And I sew this part to this part. This part should go to that part, I believe. And if it's confusing in the 3D viewport or in the 2D viewport, remember you can always go into the 3D viewport and sew these things together. Space, sim, not space sim, but space to simulate. And now, the t-shirt is starting to come together. So an additional tool you can use if you aren't getting the folds that you really want. Oh, I forgot to cut these. Cut and sew, let's do that there as well. So ignore what I just said and we'll get back to that in like 2 seconds. Okay, everything is sewn together. Cool. Is the use of elastics. Elastics is a really cool tool. It just, it just makes whatever line you select like a rubber band. So it just pulls in on itself. So with the Z tool, like the edit, I never use like the edit and pattern tool, just shift select these two here. And then again in the property editor, just say elastics on. There you go. And now he has this super girly go in a bed dress shirt or something.
It went from really cool to really lame very quickly.
But what you can do is if you do select the elastics here, so this is just the default. The ratio is set to 80. I find that changing the strength is minimal what it does. I usually just change the ratio. So this is just to cheat it a little bit. I'll set it to like 98, something high. It just adds a little bit of undulation down here at the bottom so it doesn't look as perfect. But it just helps create a little bit of variation. It's not very realistic to do this, but I just find it helps. Sometimes you can find though when you do these kind of changes that everything messes up and you have to like redo your sim. So let's say that this was like a black hole. It's really hard to create it on purpose. But let's say, okay, it's super messed up. What you can do is you can select your fabrics in the 3D viewport and right click and say reset 3D arrangement. That's going to put it where it was before. We'll just move it into place again and hit Control-G to flip horizontally, sim again, and that just sort of like forces it to resim from the beginning. So sometimes can be annoying if you have super advanced fabrics, so just make sure to save pretty regularly.
And how do you drag the materials there with, is that just a left mouse button?
Yeah, just so like you select any fabric, whoops, like that, you just drag it like that.
No, I mean like the it's almost like you have like a hand which moves the fabric.
You can adjust your fabrics, right? So here, when you're in sim mode, you can move the fabric like this. That's a regular, like you're just in sim mode, you hit the Q or the A button, and then that gives you your sort of like drag selection tool.
Very nice.
Yeah, I think we haven't covered that until now. But yeah, that's how you would drag it around. So next up, we're gonna cover the steam tool. Like this is a tool I'm kind of reluctant to use most of the time because it's, like obviously we're doing 3D, so we're cheating already, but this is really cheating. What the steam tool does is like exactly like a normal iron in real life. It can iron out a lot of folds. So let's say we had folds here that we didn't like. You can go into your 2D view, select it here. Okay, that's where our fold is. Then you just select this. You get your shrinkage, so how much it's going to pull together, the size of your brush, and the hardness and percentage. I usually leave these by default, and then you can just sort of paint on this. So you can do it while simming is activated, so you can real time, you can see the change. So like then it starts to pull in. If you activate this tool, it might be a little easier to see. Now you can see we're creating tension in here. This good color, still good color, but slightly bad. We want it to be as blue as possible. But if we just keep painting here, you can see we start to pull the fabric in. Now we actually create more folds instead of getting rid of them. It's a really cool tool. I would use it sparingly, but it definitely has its use cases. Just quickly wanted to cover that, and let's just undo all of that. There you go. Like I said, it's not something that I tend to use a lot. Sometimes I'll go over like a little piece of my fabric and just like quickly with the steam tool just to make sure that nothing is all messed up. All right, so the fabric being in this condition now, we want to sort of like get towards finalizing it. So let's merge these things together, and that's as simple as what we did before. We just select the edit pattern tool with the Z key, right click on a line and say merge. It's going to merge that over there, so offset it a little bit to the center. We can do that here as well. Merge, like that. With the A key, you get the transformation tool. Just edit that a little bit. Now these have been merged. So, I would recommend that we do that for these as well, just to keep them consistent. Merge. Sometimes you can find when you merge stuff that your sewing line actually disappears because now it's a new fabric. If you merge across something where there's no longer a connection point, then it just falls apart. So then you have to re-sew it. But, I feel like the trade-off you get by doing symmetric sewing is well worth waiting with until the end when okay, I'm done with all of my changes. There you go. So now these have been sewn together. So, by this point, it's pretty much a finished t-shirt. A t-shirt is not that advanced, but I feel like it helps you cover a lot of the different pieces and tools you need in order to get started with Marvelous. But there is another use case for the internal tool or the internal lines that we haven't covered. So we'll just create like a little breast pocket for him right here, just to show you what else you can use it for. So the internal line lives up here. That's just where you draw out the internal line. It's not just something that you can generate from something. You can actually you can trace this, around inside if you wanted complex shapes. So for our breast pocket, we'll just keep it fairly simple, and we'll just make it a square or like a rectangle. And then what we can do is with A again, you select the inside of it. You just say, you right click and, let's do the Z key, select the line of it, and then you can offset or clone it as a pattern. So now it's been cloned, it's like it's been stamped out. Now it's super easy. Now we have our breast part. You could always detail this more. Just hit N, and then we can sew the different sides on here. Remember, don't sew it on like that, sew it on like that. Now we can sew that on there, hitting space. Now we cool little breast pocket there. So a really cool thing, again, with everything where we have internal lines, now we can start generating more internal lines for detailing. So So with the Z key, you can just marquee over this, you can right click it, and then you can say offset as internal line. We'll stick to the 7 millimeters. Just offset it internally like this. And if we select these now, we can change the fold angle. Let's do 220 this time. And then we can sim it again. So now it creates an extra bit of detail. So, you know, this is pretty close to like the end of this fabric now. So then we can start playing around with different properties of the fabrics. So first off, if you just hit A and then select everything, you get into your fabrics here. So these are like the folding strength and elastics that we talked about before. Now, if what you can also do is you can change the particle distance, kind of like we did with the now hidden reference sheet here. So this one we made lower res by increasing it. For these other ones, what we can do is we can actually make them higher res, so by decreasing the particle distance. So again, we can just select our fabric, and then we go down to particle distance. So for this one, like while I'm still simming and like refining stuff, I'll keep it to like 10. And then once I'm ready to finalize, I'll lower this to maybe 5 or even 3. And then it gets quite high res. So just sim it again, and then we sort of like resolve all the details. Now we get a little nicer result. What you can do for something like a breast pocket here as well is you could individually select this piece, for example, and then you could change the particle distance for this one to something like 5, because maybe you wanted to allocate like more detail just to the breast pocket, for example. Then what you can do is you can define how your fabrics, like what kind of fabric it is. And that's pretty easy by just selecting the fabric, select it, and then you can change the presets. So, you know, we can't go over all the presets, but you feel free to mess around with these. You can do like denim raw, and then if you do it in sim mode at the same time, you sort of get like feedback. Featherweight nylon is really good for a lot of crinkly details. You have leather, cowhide to puff it out a little bit. Maybe good for like a leather jacket. Actually looks kind of cool.
Pretty dramatic differences you have between them though.
Yeah, like if you go to something like silk chiffon, it falls down. It doesn't actually wrinkle a lot, but the fabric becomes really heavy, kind of like for curtains and stuff like that. So, you know, that's how you would do that. But we'll just keep it to default simulation for now. One advantage of default simulation is that it's actually a lot faster to sim compared to the other ones as well. And then just to cover some, I guess, some bonus tools that you might be needing as well. The first one is going to be the UV editor. So once you're done with your fabrics here, just ignore that one for now. You can, actually, we'll ignore it so much that we'll delete it. There we go, because we don't need it anymore. We've done our work here.
It's pre-ignored.
You can go into a UV editor and just right click and say fit UV into unified tile. So that just fits it into the first UV tile. You pull into Maya, Blender, whatever. This is going to sit here. The way we usually work with this in production is that we have a dedicated Marvelous tile or UV set. So this is going to be one UV set. This doesn't need to be perfect. We'll create another UV set in something like Maya where we lay it out properly. But this is just make sure that we can always jump between Maya and Marvelous, and we can transfer its attributes like the mesh based on UVs. If you don't know what any of that means, don't worry about it. It's cool for production. The other part is going to be the sculpt tool, which is probably the worst sculpt tools you'll ever use. But if you do have changes, like let's say you don't have access to ZBrush or sculpting in Blender, whatever it is, and you just want to do some quick fixes inside of Marvelous, this tool is great for that. Usually what I've used it for is use this move brush here. You can just take a piece and like, let's say you get weird intersections, just move that out of the way a little bit or make them into like a weird Spider-Man.
That's very nice right there.
And then you jump out of sculpt mode again, that's going to stay there. Except if you simulate, it's going to go away. So I use it sparingly, but for adjusting my patterns a little bit. And that's about it.
Yeah, it's not a ZBrush replacement.
No, definitely not. But it does help you with just making small tweaks, and you can go in and sculpt. We have a more in-depth video on this. It's also free on the YouTube channel. We'll link below. But yeah, that covers hopefully everything you need to know about Marvelous Designer in order to get started.
And if you want to see more of that, we have, like we mentioned in the beginning, we have a lot of premium products which take you a lot further as well. So if you want to really make some cool fabrics, we highly recommend you check those out as well.
So thank you guys so much for watching. Really hope you enjoyed this free introduction. If you want to see more free introductions, hopefully a little shorter in the future, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you get notified every time we put out more free introduction videos.